conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, I've spoken quite a few times about the massive amount being spent on EVs by this state, as well as, of course, the federal government. And my covering of this content has created quite the debate online, as well as I didn't really dig into this, at least this week, past couple of weeks, about what government's role is and why the state legislature continues to allow Beshear to do these things. And also, of course, a debate about the state spending federal tax dollars versus state tax dollars and just kind of all of that. And I thought all of that was worth a quick look at as we dig in today. Also, Louisiana passes a law requiring the 10 Commandments in all K through 12 classrooms. Is that a good idea for Kentucky? And can/should it happen here? I'll weigh in. Speaking of schools, the tire fire that is the public education sector is on full display this week as we see the COVID relief funds are drying up and public schools are just absolutely losing their minds because they never figured out how to manage their money in the first place. And many of them, we're finding out, have spent them on everything but what the money was originally for. Goes in line with some of the themes of this week, as I've talked about governments getting handed money and handouts from the federal government, states and counties and school districts, and then not spending them solely for what they're meant for. And then when they dry up, they're like, I don't know how to continue now. And then finally, assuming we have time, Louisville Metro Police Department is having a really, really bad couple of weeks. And the hits keep coming, which leads to the question of why is the police chief there? Why is she still suspended with pay and not just fired by now? We'll have all that and more on today's show. But first, as always, I'd love to encourage you to head on over to theandrewshow.com, hit the contact tab. You can also email info@theandrewshow.com. Actually, a few of today's stories were articles or inside information sent to me from listeners of the show. So I certainly appreciate that. Helps save me a little bit of work. And also, if there's something important going on that you want to draw attention to, it gives you the opportunity to help get the word out there. That's why we do this show, to help spread the word on important issues. But also, as you're listening, if you're listening on the podcast format, please head on over and leave a review. Make sure you subscribe and hit the follow tab as well. I know a lot of you are new listeners. Make sure you leave that review. It helps out, as well as make sure if you're listening on WZXI or anywhere else, make sure you're telling others to tune in to the show, help grow the audience, but also help grow people getting informed. Without further ado, let's dig into it. So earlier this week, I've gone into how Beshear's got this $84 million plan that is being funded in large parts by the federal government to build 42 charging stations. That works out to a cost of over $600K a station. And I brought that up to kind of point how we're just going to dump billions of dollars into electric vehicles, trying to make them happen. And I made a post about that spending, and it moved around quite a bit. And in the post, I also told people that, gas stations and supermarkets can add electric charging for about $50,000 to $60,000 or so a spot. And yet, here is the federal government and the state government spending millions upon billions and spending way more than that in the process, which leads to the question of why is government doing this in the first place? Now, if you make a post about that, or if you say to leftists or the economic developers or what have you, that, hey, why is government spending billions of dollars on electric vehicles? One, they'll call you a Stone Age person. They'll tell you electric vehicles are going to happen and they're coming and you just need to get over it. Why are you resisting it so much? And nobody's resisting it. If electric vehicles just happen on their own, great. That's fantastic that people made the decision to switch to electric vehicles. And I see a lot of opportunities where you could see people wanting to switch to electric. For an example, you could have one car gas, one car electric in order to, drive into town, run errands, and then you have another one that's gas, and that's a good option if it makes sense for those families. But if it doesn't make sense, they shouldn't be forced to pay billions of dollars trying to make the industry work. And they're trying to make the industry work because they have to build out the infrastructure for refueling. And so rather than doing it the most cost-effective way possible of just allowing private companies to go ahead and build up electric chargers if they want to do it and the government get out of it. For example, Tesla, when they were first putting out electric vehicles, they started building charging stations because they wanted people to start. They handled it on their own because they knew that if we don't build out a charging station, well, then people won't purchase electric vehicles. It's very important that we do that so they feel comfortable buying one. And they understood that, so they built them out. But now the federal government's coming in and saying, hey, we're going to build this out now too as well, and we're going to spend a lot more money than we need to doing it. And so when I brought this up, some people wanted to ask, well, what's the specs here? Are they having to buy land and build out pavements and lots and things? Because, you're quoting a $50,000 to $100,000 cost for supermarkets or gas stations to add these on. Well, they already have a lot of this infrastructure in place, and so now the state has to come in and build out this infrastructure. So, that's why the expense is so high. But that leads to the point of two things. One, why is the government building out infrastructure like this in the first place? If the government does have a role in putting in electric vehicle chargers, you would think they'd be doing them at places like, the rest areas along the way, trying to put chargers in there where they already have parking lots, already have infrastructure in place that they can kind of build off of. Or perhaps they would be offering tax subsidies to private industry in order to install these chargers at gas stations, and as such, much more effective and cheaper ways to do this. But that's assuming it's government's role in the first place. And I brought that up, that this really isn't government's role. And a lot of people tried to claim that, without the government building out the highway systems, cars wouldn't have been a thing. And to which I can see kind of what you're saying there. We can go into it and argue about how good the government is at building roads and everything else, but putting all of that to the side, and we can put it to the side, the point would be, though, is that, government built out roads, but they didn't have to build out gas stations. Gas stations came on their own, and what you're talking about now isn't what you did for gas-powered cars, because electric vehicles already have roads to drive on from the gas-powered cars. What you're talking about doing now is government doing a new thing for electric vehicles that they didn't do for gas, of building out now the refueling stations. And so the claim is, when I call out this kind of spending, they say, well, you're just being negative. They're spending this money. It's an investment for the people. It's giving people, literally somebody commented and said, well, it's giving people the opportunity and access, everybody to have access to electric vehicles. To which I ask, just to Ford alone to build electric vehicle battery plants, the federal government has given them billions, $3-4 billion. And then state governments on top of that have kicked in another several billion. So that alone is $6 billion-ish or so dollars going to Ford just for electric vehicle battery plants, not to mention the tax subsidies and rebates and as such that they're offering to both consumers and these companies on top of that. Is that worth the value to the taxpayer? Is this actually an investment for them to what? Before you try to argue anything else, what benefit is it to the taxpayer for them to have an electric vehicle build-out system? It's all based upon some green energy thing, but to the taxpayer themselves. So basically, they already have access to something that costs less or the same at similar levels, right? Similar build-outs, basically cost the same. And they already have refilling systems all in place everywhere for them to refill. They already have the same ranges. Like, there's no benefit here to the taxpayer, period. You're not delivering any investment for them. So why do we do this as a state? Well, we've dug our hole because we gave hundreds upon millions of dollars to the Ford battery plant. And if we don't dump these more money, throwing good money after bad in, well, then it will make those who made that decision to give Ford that money look bad. The people who made that decision is both Beshear and the Republicans, and they can't look bad, and that is why our legislature continues to allow it to happen. But that also brings up the conversation of federal versus state tax dollars. We'll be talking about that because it goes into our next segment after this short break. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, I was just kind of going into this week, I'd really talk a fair amount about just the amount of money the state is spending on these electric vehicle things. And of course, I post about online. I've heard arguments back and emails from people about it. And one of the common comments that I hadn't hit on yet was that, well, Andrew, a lot of these, especially this 80-something million dollars we're now spending on electric vehicle chargers, well, it's coming from the federal government. And so for that reason, you shouldn't take any issue with it. And first and foremost, this money coming in from the federal government, let's pretend for a second like the argument that, oh, that's somehow different because, it's not tax dollars. Like there's this weird mental thought process a lot of people in state government have, especially, that federal dollars is like free money. Like, oh, this is just magical money into our accounts. Let's just spend it like crazy. Let's bend over backwards for as much federal dollars as we can because, they're just handing it out, so we might as well take it up on it. And so this common refrain of, well, that's federal money. The state isn't paying for that. Well, the state doesn't pay for a lot of things it does. It simply facilitates the federal dollars coming in. But regardless of the source of money, if it's coming from the government, no matter where it's at, it's still tax dollars. It's still our money. And it's still coming from somewhere. And they should still be a good steward of other people's money, regardless if it's all coming out of the Kentucky taxpayer's pocket or if it's coming out of somehow, some way that everybody across the country's pocket or however they justify that. They should still be good stewards of it. And spending ridiculous amounts that you don't need to spend on things like electric vehicle chargers is not being a really good steward of the federal money. And to go along with that, being a bad steward with federal dollars, we can look at a few different situations we see coming out of two different school districts. So Beshear, we heard him quite a bit, talk about how the school teachers needed raises, not just like more money, right? He wasn't advocating for schools to get more money. He was advocating for specifically teachers and administrators to get an 11% raise covered by the state. Not just the state just gives a bigger pot of money to each district for them to decide what to do with. He wanted it to be a line item in the budget. And never mind, and ignore the fact that you can't line item that. It would be most likely unconstitutional because it has been long held based upon state Supreme Court rulings and interpretations that our state constitution meaning is that every school must have, from the state side of things, equitable funding. They've got to have pretty equal funding across the board. So the way that they achieve that as a state right now is something called the SEEK formula, where it's an amount paid out to each district per student. It sits right around, I think, $4,400 a year right now. And then that gets paid out to each district per student. But if you suddenly come in and do an 11% raise, well, your per student payment is going to be different by each district. Because, take for an example, Jefferson County Schools, they have a lot more administrators than other districts do, getting paid a lot more. And so the amount per student they would end up spending if they just line itemed an 11% raise would be far greater than the amount per student that they'd spend on maybe a more rural district. And so it's kind of unconstitutional to line item it. But it's not hard to understand why Beshear would want them to line item it when you realize that these districts are absolutely the worst at managing their funds as well as using funds for what they're supposed to be used for. They're not good stewards of those dollars. And for the first school district story about this, we're going to turn to actually Boyd County, Kentucky. Boyd County announced that they will have a massive budgetary shortfall, not massive, but a pretty huge budgetary shortfall because they overspent on teaching salaries. This from actually the Daily Independent in Ashland, Kentucky, wrote by Mary Jane Epling, I believe. Mary Jane Epling. The Boyd County School District will receive $645,000 from the State Departments of Education after an unforeseen budget shortfall could have affected staff salaries. Unforeseen budget shortfall. We didn't see it happening. We didn't know we'd be over $500,000 short. Who could have guessed? Now, they didn't have an emergency, right? The budget shortfall wasn't because, tornadoes came through or there was flooding or something like that they couldn't deal with. No, it's because they had a big problem with giving too much salaries out to too many people that they weren't prepared to continue forward. And so what it deals with here is that the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, those are like the ARPA funds, like the COVID dollars coming in, those funds, now quoting back from the article here, they asked Boyd Superintendent Bill Boblett to explain himself. Why are you falling $645,000 short? This is what he said. He said, bottom line, it came from overspending for this fiscal year. Yeah, well, no, duh. Yes, you're $645,000 short because you overspent. Thank you for explaining basic finance to us. Maybe you should go to more advanced finance so this doesn't happen. But anyways, Boblett said, specifying the district had used elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds to employ extra teachers for reading and math intervention. Those funds, according to Boblett, weren't expected to dry up until the 23-24 school year, which would have given the district time to cut the extra positions for 24-25 as planned. Instead, those funds dried up in March, 2 months before the end of the school year. We thought we'd have enough in contingency to pay salaries and so forth. We did not, Boblett said. I take full ownership in that. The budget wasn't clearly watched, and that's the basis of the shortfall. Under advisement from the Department of Education, Boblett said the district has added a financial advisor and made a couple of changes in the finance department. Well, it is important that they're making changes, including the return of former district finance director Don Flew, who Boblett said retired roughly 5 years ago. They're bringing him back on board to say, look, we got to right this ship here. We overspent. It's wrong. So I'm glad they're making those changes, but it does point out that they have these extra reading and math intervention that they've been offering from these ARPA funds. But as these things are coming to an end, we saw this with Lexington school districts and others, their management of them has been on full display that it hasn't been super great. And before you say, well, at least they spent their money on what they should have, because remember what the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds were for. They're two things. One was to handle and prepare for COVID and then coming back as far as technology and masks and gloves and barriers and sanitizing and extra cleanings and et cetera, et cetera. And then it was also to help students catch up from learning loss. And so at least they were spending it on helping to catch up with learning loss. But chances are that is not what most of the money went to. It probably went to some silly boondoggle that the districts has cooked up, and now they ended up spending money they don't have. And the reason why I bring up that it probably went to some boondoggle is because that's exactly what happened to Christian County Public Schools. I was sent this letter from a listener, actually sent it in. So please, if you have tips or things that you notice, please reach out. Email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com, or head on over to theandrewshow.com, hit the contact tab, and fill out a contact form if you'd like to. Reading now from the letter, I'm just going to read a chunk of this here. So Christian County Public Schools was awarded $31,953,616 in federal ARP ESSER funds, that's the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, as the third round of stimulus funding in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. When these funds were awarded, KDE required districts to allocate at least 20% of the award for learning loss and provide an ARP ESSER plan, spending plan, reopening and continuation of services plan, and budget. All documents were approved by the board and placed on CCPS's website in accordance to KDE requirements. Since that time, CCPS has utilized the 20% learning loss allocation of ARPA funds for freshman seminar teachers, guidance counselors, summer learning opportunities, Camp Kinder, and various other education initiatives, including technology, software, and hardware. The remaining 80% of the ARP ESSER allocation was budgeted for use in the new Christian County High School construction project. So instead of, they're giving this money to help make up learning loss. And what Christian County Schools decided to do is use 80% of it to build a new school, which, by the way, the new Christian County High School project, a lot of the local people there don't want it. They think it's a useless expenditure of funds. They disagree with it harshly because they know it will just send up their taxes. And they're like, this isn't needed. We don't need these super fancy schools. Why are you doing this? So even people in the community don't want the school. But despite that, they said, look, we spent 80% on school construction, so you should be happy with that. What's funny is when they talk about the 20% they did utilize for what you think the monies would be for, to be like, hey, we need to make it through COVID, and then on top of that, we now need to catch everybody back up. So they claimed some things that they spent it on was, freshman seminar teachers, which is okay, summer leading opportunities, Camp Kinder, and various other education initiatives, okay. They spent the money also on guidance counselors. Guidance counselors. What does that have to do with learning loss? You were given money to deal with COVID and learning loss, and they spent on guidance counselors and a new school. It's the same reason why government budgets for infrastructure and police last. They budget for actual teaching at these schools last. Why is it that they budget it last? Look what happened at Boyd County. They ended up short. And what they fall short on? Salaries for teachers. Not for, fancy new equipment or any kind of other initiatives that they decided they had the money for. It was salaries for teachers. It's last. Why? Because they know the taxpayer will always have a sympathetic ear and a sympathetic mind for them claiming they just need some more money to make it work. Well, coming up after this, we'll dig into Louisville Metro Police Department having a really bad time. We'll have that after this short break. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So just a recap here. Louisville Metro Police Department is having quite a rough couple of weeks. So, Louisville Metro Police Department. So you may remember I covered in the show, I believe, earlier in the week about how the chief was put on paid leave after an incident regarding a Major Brian Kruger. So basically, the chief went around to all the majors on a conference call, on like a Zoom call, and asked before she promoted Krieger if anybody had any objections to, I think it's Kruger, I think that's how I say his name, any objections to Kruger being promoted to lieutenant colonel. And one of the majors, a woman, Kruger's a guy, spoke up and said, he sexually assaulted me and sexually harassed me, and I don't think I can work with him for that reason. And I dug into kind of the allegations and some of the audio on that in a show earlier this week, so make sure you take a listen. Or I think it was probably last week. I think it was last week, maybe. Anyways, you'll have to take a listen to that. Head on over to theandrewshow.com, hit the Listen Now tab to check out old shows, or if you're listening on a podcasting platform, you can see the old shows right there in the library. Anyways, after that incident, the Mayor Greenberg sent the chief of police on paid administrative leave. Well, the hits just keep coming. This now from WHAS 11. 3 rounds of sexual harassment allegations, including 2 lawsuits, have been filed against the police department in the last week. On Thursday, allegations of sexual harassment were made by the department by a current officer for the 3rd time in the last week. Police Chief Jacqueline Gwynn Villaroli, Jacqueline, is on paid administrative leave for her handling of at least 1 incident. Greenberg spoke at a news conference and said the sexual harassment will not be tolerated in the department or Metro government. I'm extremely concerned about the multiple sexual harassment allegations within the LMPD. Acting Chief Paul Humphrey and I take this very seriously, and we have been working all week to make meaningful changes. The allegations made public this week in 2 lawsuits are incredibly upsetting and very difficult to read. Last week, an attorney for Major Shannon Lauder released a recording in which she accused Major Brian Krieger Kruger of sexual harassment. Then on Thursday, Louder and her husband, Louisville Metro Police Department Lieutenant Jeff Louder, were accused of sexual harassment in a lawsuit filed by Sergeant Lauren Carby. I'm sorry. She releases the thing on sexual harassment and then somebody else is claiming sexual harassment. And then you have now Officer Christine Silk filed a sexual harassment lawsuit Tuesday accusing officers Justin Lemon and Dale Cottingham. According to Carby's lawsuit, LMPD spent $40 million to settle claims between 2017 and 2022. $40 million. And so the whole entire issue here, all these lawsuits coming out, just the entire upper echelon of management just falling apart, accusals running left and right. The whole department here is just apparently just fraught with sexual harassers, it would appear. And then outside of that, you have the issues, of course, the Scheffler incident. You've had the issues with the no pursuit policy coming under a lot of scrutiny. You've had issues with the federal government investigating them for use of force incidences. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of the troubles this place is having. And it leads to one question. Why is the Louisville Metro Police Department Chief, Jacqueline, still employed there? Yes, she's on leave, but she's on paid administrative leave. And this isn't her first issue either. She should have been fired a long time ago. And this here from the Courier Journal, wrote by Joseph Girth. When Louisville Metro Police Chief Jacqueline wrongly testified she wasn't wearing a body camera when she arrived on the scene of a deadly accident, the obvious move for Mayor Greenberg was simple. Fire her. He didn't. When the Courier Journal reported that she lied when she was a member of the Atlanta Police Department and was suspended for 20 days and didn't divulge this to Louisville officials when they hired her, the obvious move was, well, obvious. Fire her. He didn't. When she couldn't bring herself to fire the wheelman in a series of incidents where officers threw big gulps, this LMPD has a lot of issues. And one of them was that officers were throwing big gulps at pedestrians as they walked along the street, which it's just so stupid. But anyways, when she couldn't bring herself to fire the wheelman in a series of incidents where officers threw big gulps at pedestrians as they walked along Louisville streets, there wasn't but one smart move Greenberg could make. Fire her. He didn't. When she thought other officers involved in Slushygate scandal deserve short suspensions rather than short walks to the unemployment office there's only one move Greenberg should have made. Fire her. He didn't. And when we learned that the 3 officers involved in the arrest of golfer Scotty Scheffler didn't turn on their body cameras despite a department history of officers not turning on their body cameras because it's, department policy, the answer was simple. Fire her. He didn't. So she lied on her applications. She's multiple times showed that she's really not very good at leading this department. And now you've got tons of sexual harassment lawsuits going on. But instead of firing her, she's on paid leave. Now, why do you think it is that Chief Jacqueline's on paid leave and not fired? And this is something Joseph Girth would never say because Joseph Girth is to the left, but I will say what it is. Simply put, Chief Jacqueline is a black woman who is a big DEI hire. Now, she, of course, had a lot of experience in police departments going into this. I won't say necessarily her hiring was simply they lowered standards because of DEI, but they certainly picked her. The fact she was a black female really helped. Like, that was a big reason, I'm sure. But the other thing is the reason why she's not fired yet, we know. It's because she's a black female. If this was a white male having all these issues under their department, do you think they would still be employed on paid leave? DEI. Chief Jacqueline knows. She knows how to work it. As evidence of this, she's the founder and ordained pastor of something called Unstoppable Praise Ministries. And if you go to their website, the first thing they talk about is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. For an example, this is on their homepage. This is their first line. It says, welcoming you home. Diversity is not just a concept that we value, but it's what we are. It is reflected in our leadership, at our weekly gatherings, and our expression of worship, and in our community. At Unstoppable Praise Ministries, we believe that God is honored when we embrace and celebrate the diversity found in our community. That's what she's head of. So it's obvious why Louisville Metro Police Department Chief Greenberg refuses to fire her, because she's a black woman heavily involved in DEI. And the moment he does, she will claim racism, and Greenberg doesn't want that. He's got a re-election to win, of course. Will he fire her? Maybe eventually. Maybe he'll become such a critical mass that he has to. Maybe he can make such a case that he has to. But until that happens, there will be a different standard at Louisville Metro Police Department, where you can have a completely incompetent leadership staff that has led a department that violates policies and apparently just full of sexual harassers and spends something like $10 million a year settling sexual harassment lawsuits, and she will, well, get to keep her job. Coming up after this, Louisiana passed their bill in order to put the 10 Commandments in all K through 12 classrooms. Is this a good idea? Should Kentucky do it? That's what I'll be going over after this short break. You're listening to The Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back here in this final segment of The Andrew Cooperrider Show. So Louisiana recently passed a law mandating that the 10 Commandments end up in all K through 12 classrooms, and they must be prominently displayed. And, you know, people get some grand ideas when things like this go on in other states. Legislators will see that. They'll say, you know what? Louisiana could do it. Why can't we do it? And they'll start to push for this kind of thing. And so is this a good idea? Should we do this or not? I would like to kind of head this off at the pass. And anybody listening to the show, if you have a relationship with legislators, please reach out to them and say, look, you don't want to do this. I'm going to say why. One is because if you're a Christian for faith reasons, and if you care about kids being indoctrinated in the classroom and things that go against especially conservative values, you're not going to want this. And I'll explain why. Because it opens up the door even more for activist teachers to just indoctrinate your kid with leftist ideas. You're leaving it wide open to them. And then there's also a political reason why you don't want to do this. But let's focus first on the types of people who would generally be for this. I'd assume would be generally Christians. You can be non-Christian for this because when you look through the 10 Commandments, there's a lot of good things in there. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill. You know, just generally good rules, right? Thou shalt not covet, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Those just generally good rules. And so prominently displaying them, having kids see them, you would say maybe that's not such a bad idea. However, you're opening up the door for even more leftist indoctrination. And generally speaking, this whole if you do this, you're opening up the door for them to do this arguments, I think they're stupid. And I think they're dumb because you don't need to open up the door for the left. The left will come through their own door. They will make a door. They will blow doors down. You don't need to open the door. It's not a slippery slope. Well, if we do this, the left will do this. The left will do that regardless. You don't have to do anything. The left will do that. I actually think in this case, we're not talking about how this opens up a slippery slope. What this is opening up an opportunity for is for teachers and far left teachers to actually use your own faith and your beliefs to indoctrinate kids. Because and I hear these calls all the time, we should have schools teaching the Bible. Well, just because somebody's teaching the Bible doesn't mean that they're teaching it in a way that you actually agree with, that actually aligns with your faith. They can be justifying it in all kinds of different ways. I mean, remember, Obama was a constitutional law professor, supposedly. So was Joe Biden, he says. But do you think you want either two of them teaching anybody about what is constitutional and what's not as they violate the Constitution constantly as presidents? Of course not. And in this same way, do you really want to open up the door for these people? We already know there's a lot of far left activists in these K through 12 education centers. Do you want to open up the door for them to get to talk to your kids about the religious faith? Because we already see these far leftists using and warping the Christian faith in order to fit their means. You see literally so-called Christian churches showing the true love of Jesus, marching in, pride parades and saying that, oh, well, if you're gay, you don't need to change anything about yourself. According to the Bible, Jesus still loves you, which is not accurate. I mean, Jesus still loves you. Jesus doesn't want you to sin anymore, though. It's not okay to sin. Jesus offers you redemption regardless of what you've done. But it doesn't mean that you should be celebrating sin as a church. But that's what they're doing. They have warped the documents, ignored parts of it to make it work for them. And you could see this with the Ten Commandments, as there would be some opportunities here where they could really warp it. For an example, let's take Commandment 3. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Now, obviously, this means using God's name like a swear word to a lot of people, but it can also mean saying you're a Christian, but not living or acting like Jesus would want you to act. And so, could you imagine a conversation where you put these up in the classroom? And now a kid, 3rd grade, 4th grade, whatever, walks up to a teacher and says, "What's thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain?" And then this teacher goes on to say, well, you're saying you're a Christian, but you're not living or acting like a Christian. And there's a whole lot of people out here who say they're Christians, but yet they hate gay people, they hate LGBTQ people, they hate Sally, who's really Billy over there, they hate all these people. And they're taking the Lord thy God's name in vain. You've just opened up an opportunity for a teacher, a far leftist individual, to interpret something to your child that goes against your beliefs. And that door is opened up by displaying these in the classroom in the first place. Because what are you going to do? You display them in the classroom, but then when a kid comes up and asks, what do these mean? The teachers aren't supposed to talk about it. Now you could right now say, look, teachers, you should just leave a religion alone in the classroom. You shouldn't talk about it. But the minute you put the 10 Commandments in there, you're opening up kids now to ask about it. And now you're okaying teachers to talk about it and give kids their interpretation. And they got your kids 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and a lot of opportunities. And a lot of parents won't be paying too much attention to exactly what their kids are being taught. We shouldn't be opening up the opportunity for these far left teachers that we already know have not all public teachers are obviously far left, but there's a good number of them. I mean, remember, every Fayette County public school has Pride Progress flags up and pictures and signs all put up by the administration itself. A lot of these places have BLM flags and everything else. Like, they're in there, these far left people. If you're a Christian, do you actually want them interpreting the 10 Commandments to your child? You shouldn't. For political reasons, you're now opening up this door while at the same time you're giving a lot of ammo to the left because, well, people are stupid. And they think separation of church and state is like an actual constitutional thing. They don't realize what freedom of religion means. And it means simply you will not be forced to practice a religion by your government. It doesn't mean anything about government not being able to display the 10 Commandments or government government literally, but they engage in prayer well before they make laws. It's how they open up each session every single day with a prayer. And so I think that's worth mentioning because freedom of religion doesn't mean freedom from religion. It doesn't mean people can't pray in the classroom. It means that you have a choice to not pray. And nothing negative should happen to you because you made that decision. And it also means there's First Amendment protections as well. And so if people are being asked to engage in religious actions and speech at certain times, you have to offer those opportunities, especially if it's government, for people to express their faith as well. So for an example, when they pray before a session or pray before a session day, up in the legislature, they pray, but you have the opportunity to bow your head and pray differently than what they're praying about. You have the opportunity to not pray, and nothing negative will happen to you. Now, would this pass in Kentucky? I don't know. I think some people up there would get the idea that this is a good idea and not be concerned enough because they live in pretty rural areas. They don't live in Lexington and Louisville. A lot of these representatives live in rural areas where they have school districts where, their teachers go to church with them. They trust them to talk about things like the Christian faith. But anybody who's living in Lexington, Louisville knows we should not be trusting any public school teacher to talk about the Christian faith to kids. Not saying there's not good ones. There's some fantastic Christian teachers in Fayette County Public Schools. I've talked to them. I've met them. I don't think that's a vast, vast majority. It could be, but I don't think so. Looking at the general makeup of Lexington, I think the vast majority of them, if given the opportunity to ask about their religious beliefs, they decline, which would be the best thing to do, best outcome. But I think a lot of them, if you open up the door, would start giving you weird interpretations of the Christian faith. And I don't think that's good for us in the long run. You also don't want the far left to be able to look at that and now campaign on, look how far right and crazy the right is. They're going to force you into religion and they hate you and blah, 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 right? I don't think I'd be giving them that ammunition when your trade-off here is you're opening up an opportunity for teachers to indoctrinate. But we did see with the trauma response teams bill, the legislature, people trying to add things in, like adding faith leaders into the trauma response teams. And, I kind of disagreed with that too, because you have no idea who's talking to your kid about religion then. And I think as a parent, that should be pretty sacred. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today and this week on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll see you back here Monday. Have a great rest of your day and have a great weekend.